Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a seriously provocative source that is completely challenging mainstream geopolitical thinking when it comes to US-China relations. We're going to explore a fascinating counter-narrative here, one that argues traditional power dynamics are actually the result of historical manipulation, not just inevitability. It's a deep dive into a wildly alternative reading of history, so let's get right into it. Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining the Thucydides Trap. Then we'll explore a controversial theory about the British geopolitical playbook. After that, we'll look at the crashing of a bilateral summit, the dismantling of old foreign policy rules, and finally, wrap up with the revival of the American system.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the Thucydides Trap defined. This is the dominant concept currently under attack.
So, to really grasp this argument, we got to start with a very specific quote from Chinese President Xi Jinping. During a state banquet, he asked, "Can China and the United States overcome the Thucydides trap and create a new paradigm of major country relations?" Now, the source points out that this exact quote is what sent the term absolutely trending on Google. Suddenly, the media was just consumed by this idea that the US was declining, China was rising, and historical conflict was basically looming right around the corner.
But what exactly is this trap? Well, popularized back in 2012 by Graham Allison, the theory claims that when a rising power challenges a declining power, war is historically inevitable. The video notes that Allison, who actually studied under former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, analyzed 16 historical power shifts over 500 years, and he claimed that 12 of them ended in war. It basically sets up a paradigm where conflict is just destiny.
Moving right along to Section 2, the British Geopolitical Playbook, a counter-narrative of manipulation. Now, here's where the source completely flips the mainstream historical perspective on its head. The argument here is that these so-called inevitable wars weren't inevitable at all. They were orchestrated. Take the ancient Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, the original basis for Thucydides. The mainstream views it as a natural clash, right? But the source actually points to Plato's dialogues to argue that the Persian Empire deliberately orchestrated the conflict to destroy Greek power. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and the video proposes that the British Empire essentially took over this exact same playbook, actively fomenting those 12 historical wars by playing sovereign nations against one another just to maintain global dominance. And that brings us to a super fascinating point in the argument. Case 11 in Graham Allison's study, the American exception. This was one of those rare instances that did not result in war. Specifically, when America outpaced Britain in the 19th and 20th centuries. The video claims this wasn't some lucky anomaly at all. Instead, it asserts that Britain avoided war because British financial and foreign policy institutions systematically colonized America's foreign policy establishment from the inside. Basically, they didn't need to fight a war because, according to this view, they had already captured the institutions.
Let's map out the historical precedents here because it shows that US and Chinese interests haven't actually always been at odds. Back in 1925, Sun Yat-sen, the founder of modern China and a big advocate for the American system of economics, passed away. Soon after, during World War II, the US and China were strong allies. The source argues that the hostility we see mapped out in later years, from the Nixon-Kissinger era in 1972 right up to Allison's essay in 2012, was actively engineered by imperial geopolitical handlers over the last century.
Okay, Section 3, crashing the bilateral summit and deploying sovereign economic power.
So the source builds toward this really crucial moment, how former President Donald Trump allegedly subverted this historical trap during a highly pivotal state visit to Beijing. The true story of this summit, according to the video, wasn't about typical trade deliverables. It was all about who actually showed up. Trump arrived in Beijing with an unprecedentedly wealthy delegation of American CEOs. We're talking Elon Musk, Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, and leaders from Boeing and GE Aerospace. This was arguably the most powerful American business delegation ever assembled on foreign soil.
And this is where things get highly unorthodox. Check out this quote from Trump recalling the event to Sean Hannity. He said, "I didn't invite them. They all wanted to come. And I suggested that before we start the meeting, I'd like to introduce them to you." The source argues that Trump deliberately hijacked the tightly controlled schedule here. By bringing these uninvited CEOs into the room with President Xi, he was physically bringing the staggering might of America's sovereign economy directly into the bilateral meeting. On top of that, the argument asserts that Trump broke another major unwritten rule by bringing his defense secretary to the summit. This was the first time a U.S. defense secretary had accompanied a sitting president to China since 1972.
This post-Nixon framework deliberately kept the Pentagon out of these things, so bringing them back to the table was seen as a direct rejection of those established norms.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, dismantling the old rules and rejecting the foreign policy handlers.
Let's look at the actual policy shifts the video cites as evidence that the old imperial rules were being actively dismantled. We see a pretty stark contrast here between two distinct foreign policy eras. On one side, you have Henry Kissinger's doctrine of mutual assured destruction, which the source describes as holding the world hostage to the constant threat of thermonuclear war. And on the other side is Trump's approach at the summit, pushing directly for denuclearization. The video claims Trump completely bypassed the expected talking points to propose a trilateral building down of arms between the US, Russia, and China.
This independent streak, it also applied to Taiwan, which is obviously a classic geopolitical trigger point. When pressed about a 1982 agreement that supposedly barred the US president from discussing arms sales to Taiwan with China, Trump openly admitted to discussing it anyway. He stated, "I think the last thing we need right now is a war that's 9,500 miles away." The theory argues this signals a flat refusal to fight wars on the terms set by traditional globalist handlers.
Finally, we hit Section 5, reviving the American system and the return of sovereign independence. This is really the climax of the source's counter-narrative, the complete rejection of globalism in favor of sovereign economic strength. According to the video, the whole premise of the Thucydides Trap relies on the idea of a declining power, right? Well, by pointing to a May 14th social media post outlining a revitalized, booming U.S. economy, the argument claims Trump completely undermined the core mathematical premise of Graham Allison's historical trap. The United States, they argue, is unequivocally no longer in decline. So what does this independence actually look like in practice? The source outlines these key pillars of a revived American system: massive tariffs, total energy independence, a manufacturing revolution, and a record $18 trillion in investment. Drawing on historical advocates like Henry Clay and modern figures like Peter Navarro, the video asserts that these economic policies are what actually give the U.S. the freedom to avoid foreign imperial control entirely. And the source ties this all back beautifully to Xi Jinping's quote about the world experiencing a transformation not seen in a century. While mainstream pundits tend to interpret this as a threat, the source interprets it literally, that the past 100 years was essentially a geopolitical cage built by the British Empire to pit the US and China against each other. And right now, that 100-year cage is finally being dismantled.
Which leaves us with a pretty massive question derived directly from the source material. If the Thucydides Trap isn't some immutable law of nature, but rather a playbook of manipulation, will sovereign nations finally escape the trap, or is history truly destined to repeat itself? It's an incredibly bold reinterpretation of geopolitics, and it really challenges us to look for the hidden hands behind historical conflicts. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a clear, structured look into this fascinating alternative perspective. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.